Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching. In today's presentation of our series Sanctions 360, we will talk about the US embargo against Cuba. And it's important to discuss the sanctions regime, although probably it is one of the most known regimes, and it's difficult to add anything new to the historical background or the scope of restrictions coming from the regimes. But certainly it's very symptomatic of how political the sanctions could be. And we would do so by way of looking to the historical background of what events led to the imposition of embargo by the United States against Cuba. We would briefly discuss key legal acts, which set out the main framework for that embargo. And then we would touch on the main elements of the embargo, and we would put that historical background into the context of today's events with respect to Cuba, as Trump administration demonstrated quite different level of interest to the country, including from the perspective of the current sanctions regime. Cuba is a very specific case in the discussion of international economic sanctions, because it's really the example of the situation when one can easily say that international economic sanctions is nothing else but a war led by other non-military means. The current situation certainly started with the revolution in Cuba, which brought to power Fidel Castro, communist regime, the regime which closely allied Cuba with the Soviet Union, as well as led into the exile the pro-American regime, which was ruling Cuba before Castro came into power. This close alignment between new Cuban authorities and the Soviet Union led to one of the pinnacles of Cold War confrontation, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when a nuclear conflict between two nuclear powers has been barely averted, and certainly resulted in Cuba being put in the focus of world geopolitics and Cold War confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. So the current sanctions and the historical background to the Cuban sanctions has to be viewed from the perspective of that type of geopolitical confrontation, when despite the prevention of the military conflict between two nuclear powers, the non-military cold type of conflict certainly persisted, and it was at its pinnacle in the late 50s and 60s. And that resulted in the imposition of embargo against the new regime, Fidel Castro, by the United States. Comprehensive embargo was announced by President Kennedy essentially the same year when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, which was followed by detailed Cuban assets control regulations imposed by the Department of the US Treasury, OFAC, which remains up until today the main piece of legislation setting out the restrictions or economic embargo which the United States imposed against Cuba. Despite various nuances in different US administrations, which likely agreed to some release of this comprehensive embargo, in essence, the regime remains unchanged. And this happened so even following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. By that time, the geopolitical conflict and tensions subsided. However, Cuban question became an important part of American domestic politics. Substantial minority of Cuban origin immigrants live in the swing states, which often determine the outcome of the US elections, most notably Florida, and accordingly, a hard line and continuation of embargo against Cuba now became an important point of winning the US presidential elections. These type of sanctions are not unheard of. Iran, for example, or North Korea, very broadly, would be subject to the same type of sanctions. However, what is noteworthy in Cuban embargo imposed by the United States, and that's why, unlike any other geographical series, we didn't call this presentation sanctions relevant for trading with Cuba, but purposefully called it the US embargo against Cuba, is that unlike Iran or North Korea, when there is a general unanimity of international community as to the necessity to impose comprehensive sanctions against those jurisdictions, the sanctions being administered to a large extent at the UN level, meaning that there is a consensus of permanent 5 members at the UN Security Council as to the scope of restrictions which are necessary to detain the missile programs and the non-proliferation issues associated with the North Korean and Iranian regimes. In case of Cuba, almost no other country in the world imposes any type of restrictions for dealing with this jurisdiction. More than this, the UN General Assembly, on a repeated basis, every year, condemns the current US embargo against Cuba, very often by unanimity. During the recent years, due to the Russian war in Ukraine and Cuban support of Russia, more states abstain. But in any case, we talk about the overwhelming majority of states in the world on an annual repeated basis condemning this embargo and calling the United States to end the embargo. So there is a sharp contrast between, on the one hand, one of the most comprehensive economic embargoes ever existing, and on the other hand, these coming from a single country in the world, with the majority of the international community taking a view that these type of measures are unlawful. This demonstrates the point, which we discussed many times, that international economic sanctions, unfortunately, quite often is just a means of politics by other non-military means, rather than an objective assessment of a threat to international peace order or fundamental values on which international community is founded. Similarly, in contrast to many other sanctions regimes in the United States, the legal basis of the Cuban sanctions program is actually founded on the acts of Congress, not the executive orders of the president, not the federal regulations which exist and which certainly detail the relevant acts of Congress, but the matter is believed to be of such an importance that Congress itself set the foundations for the US sanctions embargo against Cuba, with the key acts being the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992 and Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act of 1996. In practical terms, though, certainly the Cuban Assets Control Regulations is the main piece of law which summarizes in a single act, in a single document, all the relevant restrictions which apply to Cuba. So to the extent your business has a US element and you want to assess whether your operations are permitted with the island, the main point of reference shall be the Cuban assets control regulations. To summarize, the key elements of the Cuban embargo is relatively easy. Almost any type of transaction is prohibited unless specifically authorized by OFAC or falls within a limited number of restrictions which is set out in the regulations. So it's indeed a fully comprehensive embargo, not focusing on specific sectors of the economy, not focusing on the cooperation in the military, industrial, or security or defense areas, as one may typically expect, not focusing on reducing Cuban capability to develop some type of advanced military technology. It's just a complete severance of economic ties with the country. And that's reflected in the relevant provision of the federal regulations, which I quote here, which in essence prohibit any type of payments, export and import transactions, as well as dealing in any property in which the Cuban state or a Cuban national has any interest. So it's a very comprehensive prohibition, and the exemptions from those prohibitions are very limited. The main exemptions are listed on the slide, and we can see the exceptional limited scope of them, which include, even with respect to travels, only permitted travels for personal or professional reasons. There is no right for general tourism to Cuba, mail operations, activity of news organizations, food donations. We talk about the operations which are extremely limited in nature. More than that, the Cuban embargo is not limited in its scope to the American citizens or those persons who are resident in the United States or the companies incorporated in the United States. Those are certainly in scope, but the embargo is more extended and includes, for example, any US corporation incorporated anywhere in the world to the extent it's controlled by the US citizens, residents, or US corporations. The result of this has led to various unpleasant situations when Cuban nationals were refused, for example, entries into the hotels in Europe on the basis that those hotels were controlled by American hotel chains. Certainly, those situations were believed to be unacceptable as discrimination on the basis of nationality and resulted in the imposition of the so-called anti-blocking statutes across various jurisdictions, including in Europe, which in essence prohibit for those companies which operate within the European Union compliance with such type of extraterritorial effect of the US statute. We made a special video dedicated to how these blocking statutes operate and what is the scope of their utility to confront this type of situations. Nevertheless, it's symptomatic that the embargo is not just limited to the United States, given its comprehensive nature, but in the view of the US administration, supposed to operate even outside of the jurisdiction. The situation in Cuba has been as described for basically last close to 70 years. And as I mentioned, there were ups and downs depending on what type of administration was in power. Carter's administration relaxed slightly in a very limited way the sanctions. Then the Reagan administration tightened the screws. We saw some relaxation of relationship with President Obama in power. And now with President Trump, we certainly witness a new circle of tightening the restrictions, although it's difficult to see how they could be further tightened. And there are two noteworthy developments which were implemented by President Trump when he came to power. One was the issuance of a national security presidential memorandum, which is, although a declaratory act, sets the main principles of the US foreign policy, which includes certainly sanctions as an important element of those politics towards Cuba, where the general tone of the memorandum is that the measures need to be even further tightened up. And that memorandum has been followed recently by the issuance of an executive order, which happened end of January 2026, titled Address and Threats to the United States with the Government of Cuba, which in particular provides for a new mechanism of imposing pressure on Cuba. The order aimed at cutting any type of oil or petroleum product supplies to the island, and the executive order aims to do so by imposing duties on the imports in the United States from the third countries which supply oil or petroleum products to Cuba. Given that historically these supplies have been largely from Venezuela, Iran, Russia, and neighboring Latin American countries, it is to be seen to which extent these type of restrictions would have any effect, as those countries are already to a large extent subject to very comprehensive restrictions in their trade with the United States, and this trade is very limited to barely existing. But certainly, given the recent events in Venezuela, at least as far as the local Latin American countries are concerned, this may have an effect of increasing further pressure of breaking relationship with Cuba. I trust that you found this presentation useful, and I hope to see you during my next presentations. Thank you very much for watching.